Hello, this is your video tutorial on how to read a text like a reader and how to read a text like a writer. In all the texts that we are going to be reading in this class this year, you're going to be looking at texts in both ways. As a reader, you're going to be looking at the content in terms of the aspects that lend itself to the reading comprehension, to understanding the text and what it is trying to tell us. As a writer, we're going to be looking at the text in terms of how the author has crafted this text. How did they organize the information? How did they structure the sentences? What types of words did they choose to use, depending on what the content is? So we're going to be analyzing, but you're going to be analyzing in two very different ways. When we read a text like a reader, first of all, we want to determine if it's a fictional or a non-fictional text, because there are, again, two different ways that you would read whether it's a fictional or a non-fictional text. If it's a fictional text, we're going to be looking at it in literary terms, and some examples are provided for you here. Like, we're going to look at the plot line. We're going to look at the exposition. What is at the beginning, the setting, where it takes place. Introduction of the characters. Is there background information that's provided? And then we get the conflict. That's where you've got the protagonist or the main character is in conflict or kind of fighting against either the antagonist, another character, or it could be a force of nature, or it could be something within themselves. That's where we come up with different types of conflict: man versus man versus self, man versus nature. From there, the events that take place create more serious. The conflict gets more and more serious. The stakes are being raised. It gets more tense, I guess you would say, until you reach the climax. And at the climax, that is where the protagonist has to make a decision or go somewhere or do something that addresses that conflict. And from there on, the story changes. No longer are the events rising. No longer is the conflict getting more intense. Now, the conflict is about to be resolved. So that's your falling action, which then leads to the resolution, which is solving the problem that the protagonist had at the beginning. We also look at characters. What types of characters? We've got our protagonist and our antagonist. Are our characters round? Are they fully developed? Do we know everything about them? Or are they flat characters, which means they're one-dimensional? We don't really get to know anything about them. Are they dynamic? Do they change over the course from the beginning to the end? Or are they static? Do they remain the same? There is no change in them. They don't change in opinion, and they don't change their mind. They don't change their attitude. So we also look at symbols. Is there an object that we see repeated over and over in the story? And could it possibly be that there is an idea, an emotion, or a concept that symbol represents? And how is that symbol important? What is the author trying to say through that symbol? And then eventually we come to the theme. What is the message that the author has for the readers? Usually it's a message about life. It's a message about society. It's a message that is universal across all genders, ethnicities, religions. It's something that applies to everyone. If we're looking at a non-fictional text, we're going to look for the main idea that the writer is trying to get across. The writer gets their main idea across in many different ways through bold print, specifically if they've got some subheadings, if they have diagrams, if they've got graphs or maps. Many times in non-fictional writing, if you look at the first sentence of each paragraph, that kind of gives you an outline of what the whole thing is about. And from that, you can get what the main idea is. We want to look at the title because many times in nonfiction, the title is going to be a huge clue as to what the main idea is for this piece. So we have to determine whether the piece is fictional or non-fictional. And then we've got various different aspects with which we can analyze the text, depending on if it's fiction or if it's nonfiction. You also want to start developing some of these habits as a reader. So as you are reading, you don't want to just take the words in your eye and then let them leak out the back of your head. A lot of times students will say, well, I read it, but I didn't really get it. Okay, well, did you really pay attention to what you were reading? That's what we mean by a habit of mind. You have to be focused. You have to be thinking about what you are reading. And here are 4 ways that you can do that. Observation. So what do you notice? As you are reading, what stands out? What's grabbing your attention? Is there an unusual detail or fact or statistic? Is there an idea or phrase that's repeated over and over again? Okay, so really pay attention to what it is you're reading. Generalization is the second step. So after you've read and you've noticed some things, what do you make of it? In general terms, so not being very specific, but in broad terms, what do you think about what the author has written? This is where you look at for patterns. You start to make connections, whether it's something that you yourself have experienced personally, that's a personal connection. It might be a connection to something else that you've read. So that would be a literary connection. Could also be something you've seen on television, in the news, in a movie, or something you've heard in a podcast, in a song lyric. So those are literary connections. And then you have historical connections. Can you take that event and tie it to a person, place, or event in history? Or perhaps it's something that's currently happening right now in our country, in our society. So that's where you start making inferences. You make judgments, judging whether or not the information is, in your opinion, valid. Is it something that's credible? You evaluate. That means you determine the value of the information. How important is it? Is it extremely important or is it not important at all? And you come to your own conclusions. The third thing you do is you look at the evidence. So what is the basis of this generalization? So you've noticed what's been written. You've decided what you're going to make of it. You've made some inferences and some evaluations. Now, how credible is this information? That's where you're going to look for facts, quotes, expert testimony, statistics, data from research. Use those 5 W's of credibility: who, what, where, when, and why. Who wrote this, or who is being quoted? What do we know about that person? What do you know about this topic? Where did the information come from? Is it from a university study, or is it from a magazine that was located at the counter of your local grocery store? When was this information presented? Is it something that's come out recently, or is it historical? Is it something that was uh, published years ago? And depending on what the topic is, does that information still is it still valid today in today's society, or have our values changed? And then why? So all text does one of three things. It either informs, it persuades, or it entertains. So that's where you have to, that's also kind of, is this a fictional? Is it entertaining me? Or is it non-fictional? Is it trying to inform me? Is it trying to persuade me using some entertainment and some information? So that's where you have to determine what is the purpose and what evidence do you have that supports that purpose. And the fourth thing is to consider some other alternatives. How could it be otherwise than what you have determined it means? So you've got your perspective. You come at any text with your own personal experiences, your family background, your educational background, your own biases, your beliefs, your values, your attitudes. There's a lot of things that we bring with us to any text. Now I want you to do so. As you've looked at this with your own filters, try to look at it from another perspective. Are there other credible positions, other ways to look at this text? Perhaps there is another cultural way to look at a text. You've looked at it through your culture. How might a different culture see this text? Perhaps there is an ethnic perspective. So you've looked at a text from your ethnicity. Is there a different ethnicity that might have a different perspective on this text? Consider gender. You've looked at the text. You've been reading about a particular character who's a particular gender. If you are that gender, you may understand what that character's saying. If you're not that gender, you might be confused about what that character is saying. Does that mean that what the character is saying is not valid? Maybe there is a different perspective that you are not aware of because you don't share that experience. We have to remember that all writing, all text can be a window, a door to something that we don't realize. So if a text is a window, that means it gives us a picture. We can look into it, but we don't experience it ourselves. It provides us some insight into what other people may be experiencing. So we see it, but we are not a part of it. However, if a text is a door, that means that we actually have walked through that and we've experienced that ourselves. We have been a part. So that experience that you're reading about is personal because you recognize it, you relate to it. So that's what we talk about. That's what I mean when it says, does it rival your position? Is there another perspective you can look at this text from? Something that you yourself have not considered through your own filters simply because of who you are. Now, when we read like a writer, we're going to look at the text from a writing point of view. We're going to look at it in terms of how writers think when they're beginning to craft their texts, when they're starting to put their things together. As writers, you know the writing process. You've been through it your entire educational career. Have you thought about, when reading a text, I wonder how the author got the idea? How did they plan to do the writing? So kind of think about those things. You want to look at it in terms of, again, the writer's purpose. Why did the author write this? And where do you find that information in the text? Where did the author decide to put the purpose in the text? Why did the author why do you think they put it there? Audience. Who is the author writing to? Where can you find that information in the text? And why do you think the writer decided to write to that audience? The form, so the format, what sort of writing will suit the purpose? So, how is the writing going to be formed? And how do you think the author chose to do that form? For what purpose? And lastly, what style do I need to write in? Every author has their own particular writing style, but depending on the purpose, why they're writing, their audience, who they're writing to, may determine how they tweak their style a little bit. They change it in order to be able to get their idea across so that the readers will understand what they're saying and either agree with them, take their side, whatever the case may be. So in addition to audience and purpose, you also want to look at tone. Tone is that emotional connection, right? That emotional feeling. So what tone, that's part of style. What emotion is the author putting out? And how do you know that's the tone? What words, what phrases is your evidence that that's the tone? When looking at a piece of writing, we want to do annotation as far as writing skills as well. We've done annotation for reading, but we also want to annotate for writing. So you can see on this example here, they circled and wrote in really big letters the famous line, "Call me Ishmael." So that is probably some of the most famous first three words in a novel comes from Moby Dick. It's something that's been quoted and requoted and used over and over again. Now, if you know that, that's great. If you don't know that, that might be something you would have to do a little bit of research. But if you know "Call Me Ishmael" is from Moby Dick, if you were to see that in a nonfiction text and make that literary connection, why would the writer start with that? What is the purpose? What is the author hoping, or what is the writer hoping to gain from using that? In habits of mind for writers, we've got 4 things you want to consider. The writer's moves. So again, this is observation, what you notice about the writing, but you want to go beyond the content and really focus on the words, focus on the structure, focus on the sequence of words or the sequence of sentences. Try to figure out how this was all put together. You're going to describe the writing. What does it look like? And you're going to want to you have to use words that you've already learned, or maybe make up new words to fit what you notice. So when you're describing the writing, you're not describing it in terms of theme or main idea or symbolism or character. You're describing the writing as far as repetition or flow or big idea or little idea, things like that. We're going to be looking at a lot of professional texts. So consider these authors your mentors. What can you learn from professional writers? When we have our reading conference, one of the questions we're going to discuss is, what have you learned about writing from the text that you're reading? So what do you notice that this writer does that you might bring into your own writing skills? Do you see them using particular word choice? Do they use content-specific words? Meaning, do they use a lot of words that are about that particular topic? Do they use a lot of very flowery language, lots of description? Do they use short sentences? Or do they use very long and complex sentences? Do they use active verbs? Do they use past tense a lot or present tense? So we're going to be looking at those things and see what you can basically kind of take from their style, incorporate into your own. And finally, we're going to look at style. What do you prefer as a reader and as a writer? What style do you like? And you're going to start developing your preferences for certain writers and also for certain genres of writing. So you're going to take a look at tone. You'll take a look at word choice. You're going to take a look at sentence structure, at grammar, at organization, sequence of ideas, all of those things. And you'll decide what writers you like to read because they're enjoyable. You find their writing interesting and fun. And what type of genres do you like? Along with this, there is another video where I'm going to take you through a text and give you an example of how to read a text first as a reader and then as a writer as well. It is going to be included in this Google Slides presentation, but I didn't include it in this video because that would make the video really long. So if you're interested in seeing an example of how to read a text as a reader and how to read a text as a writer, look for this Google Slides presentation and you will find those videos included.